Welcome back. So today we're diving into chapter 7, which focuses on one of the most practical and immediately uh, relevant topics we'll cover: getting a job. Just about all of us have had the experience of being hired to do a particular job at some time in our life. Sometimes it's answering a newspaper ad or responding to a help wanted sign, but other times it involves an extensive search by both employer and employee. What is really fascinating is that the way jobs are allocated reflects many essential features of our economy and society: racial, ethnic, and gender divisions, the distribution of power, social networks, and laws and regulations. So let's look at how all of this works. Let's start with a fundamental shift in how people find and hold jobs. We need to understand what economists call the labor market. Though this represents a massive historical change from how things used to work, in chapters 1 and 2, we saw how jobs were apportioned largely on the basis of ascribed characteristics for most of human history. So your work reflected your gender, it reflected your ethnicity, your age, and the family you were born into. But the labor market has, to a significant degree, superseded employment based on these ascribed characteristics like gender, race, ethnicity, and family position. In modern society, we assume that an impersonal market sorts people into particular jobs at particular and appropriate rates of pay. Just as there are markets for soybeans and petroleum, cars and shoes, labor can be described as a kind of commodity allocated by market forces. Now we'll see that job allocation involves considerably more than just impersonal market forces, but the market is still an important factor in determining who does what in the modern economy. The labor market operates like other markets through the interaction of supply and demand. In this case, employers are the source of demand while job seekers are the source of supply. So think about how this works. When employers need workers, they create a demand for labor. When people need jobs, they supply labor to the market. The key insight is that markets bring supply and demand into equilibrium through the price mechanism. And in labor markets, that price is wages and salaries. Well, this creates some predictable patterns. High wages will attract many job seekers, while low wages will result in many potential workers looking elsewhere for better paying work. On the employer side, low wages make it worthwhile to hire more workers, while high wages might cause them to be more selective about hiring. Here's how the market is brought to equilibrium through the price mechanism. Low prices for labor will motivate employers to hire more workers, while high wages and salaries will motivate more people to join the labor force. So this is a constant balancing act. When wages go up, more people want those jobs, but employers become more reluctant to hire. When wages go down, fewer people want the jobs, but employers are more willing to hire. The market finds a balance point where supply meets demand. This also explains why wages fluctuate with economic conditions. During economic expansion, employers compete for workers and wages rise. During recessions, there are more job seekers than jobs, and wage pressure decreases. The labor market also explains occupational sorting, how people end up in different types of jobs. Jobs and occupations requiring high levels of talent and training command high salaries because these wages need to be motivating talented individuals to devote themselves to lengthy periods of study and training. So think about the years of education required to be a doctor or a lawyer. In contrast, many occupations and jobs pay low wages because they are easily filled. The task might be important. Imagine if no one picked up garbage, but the pay is poor because many people can perform these jobs. Now, here's a key assumption in economic theory. Work is considered a disutility. It's something that diminishes quality of life. From this perspective, work replaces more enjoyable activity. So, for the main reason of working is to be paid. A job that pays poorly won't be attractive, even if the work is satisfying. Well, a good paying but unpleasant job will be hard to resist. This brings us to another key assumption that both workers and employers are rational maximizers. From this perspective, pay is the primary determinant of the numbers of workers in particular jobs and occupations and how much they work. The theory assumes that people know what they want, can directly connect their actions with achieving goals, and have all the information necessary to make optimal decisions. Workers will choose jobs that maximize their income relative to the work required, while employers will hire workers who maximize productivity relative to wages paid. But of course, this is a simplification of how people actually think and behave. No economist really believes we're uncomplicated, rational maximizers, but these assumptions provide a useful starting point for understanding worker and employer behavior. The reality is that economic motivation does not explain all human behavior, and supply and demand economics fails to give the complete picture of how labor markets actually work. For example, we can imagine two possible supply of labor curves. One involves opportunity cost, the idea that time spent not working is income lost. So higher wages motivate people to work more hours. But there is also the possibility of a backward bending supply curve, indicating that higher levels of remuneration may actually reduce labor participation. This backward bending curve occurs when workers decide they have sufficient income for their lifestyle. So when wages go up, they can work fewer hours and still maintain their standard of living. Max Weber observed this phenomenon decades ago with German agricultural workers who worked less when they received higher pay because their needs were met. Here is what economists call the normal supply of labor curve. As you can see, it shows a positive relationship between wages per hour and hours worked. The logic is straightforward. The more you're paid per hour, the more hours you'll want to work because time spent not working represents money lost. This makes intuitive sense for most of us. If you're earning $10 an hour, taking a day off costs you 80. But if you're earning $50 an hour, that same day off costs you 400, a much higher opportunity cost that might motivate you to work instead of taking leisure time. But here's the fascinating alternative, the backward bending supply curve. This shows what happens when workers reach a point where they have sufficient income for their chosen lifestyle. Beyond that point, higher wages actually lead to fewer hours worked because they can maintain their standard of living with less work. Weber documented this with German farm workers who were paid per task. When pay rates increased, they actually worked less because they could meet their needs with shorter working days and have more time for other activities. While this might have been common a century ago, it's much less evident today, where consumer culture creates endless desires for more goods and services. Now let's turn to one area where government intervenes in the labor market, minimum wage laws. The historical first effort came in the 1930s as part of Roosevelt's National Recovery Act, but this was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The minimum wage returned with the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, initially set at 25 cents an hour. It is important to note that all occupations are not covered. Notably, waiters, waitresses, and other service employees who receive tips often have different standards. Also, unlike Social Security payments, the federal minimum wage is not adjusted for inflation, so its real value drops over time unless Congress votes to increase it. There's ongoing debate about minimum wage laws. Some economists suggest that even low minimum wages make workers too expensive for many employers. Following market logic, unemployment will ensue if workers' pay exceeds the revenue they generate for the company. But others suggest that higher wages can actually increase motivation and productivity, potentially offsetting higher labor costs. This is called the efficiency wage theory. Henry Ford famously demonstrated this in 1914 when he began paying workers $5 a day, almost double the average manufacturing wage. Ford claimed this higher wage more than paid for itself by reducing employee turnover and training expenses. A major objection to federal minimum wage laws is that the primary beneficiaries are not the working poor. This is true in a statistical sense. In 2024, only 1% of hourly workers earned at or below the federal minimum wage of $7.25, with most minimum wage earners living in families with higher total incomes. However, looking at the demographics reveals important patterns. Workers under age 25 represent only 1/5 of hourly workers, but accounted for 43% of those earning minimum wage or less. Among employed teenagers aged 16 to 19, 2.6% earn minimum wage or less, nearly 4 times the rate for workers 25 and older. The impact on racial and gender groups shows continuing disparities. While 1% of white, black, Asian, and Hispanic workers earn minimum wage or less, women were more likely than men to earn these wages. 1.3% of women versus 0.8% of men among hourly workers. By occupation, service workers were most affected, with 3.2% earning minimum wage or less. Nearly 3 out of 4 minimum wage workers were employed in service occupation, mainly in food prep and serving jobs. The leisure and hospitality industry had the highest percentage at 5.6, with about 2/3 in all minimum wage workers employed in this sector. While the numbers earning exactly minimum wage are relatively small, increases still significantly help the lowest income workers. The 2024 poverty level was $16,320 for a single person, while someone earning $725 for 40 hours a week makes just over $15,000 annually before taxes, keeping most families well below the poverty line. Now let's shift to thinking about workers from the employer's perspective. For employers, workers constitute a cost of doing business, but employees are also productive assets. They produce revenue and profits. Workers bring skills, abilities, and personal qualities to their jobs. These attributes are like physical capital that increase productivity and revenues, so economists call them human capital. It's perhaps a crude term, but it captures the idea that workers' capabilities are a valuable asset. So the concept of human capital helps explain why some people get better jobs and higher pay than others. It's not just about supply and demand, but about the value workers bring to employers. High levels of human capital are strongly linked to good jobs, and high rates of remuneration and education is the most common source of human capital. We can see this in the strong relationship between education and labor force participation. The recent 2024 data show this pattern continues strongly. College enrollment rates for recent high school graduates reached 62.8%, with labor force participation at 41.2% for college enrolled graduates. More telling, unemployment rates vary dramatically by education. Those with bachelor's degrees have just 3% unemployment for males and 2% for females, compared to 7% for high school graduates and 8 to 11% for those without any high school completion. The pattern is clear. More education correlates with greater workforce participation and employment security. The role of education becomes even more apparent when we look at earnings. Education correlates with the extent of labor force participation and is strongly reflected in earnings differentials. It's often seen as an investment that pays off abundantly. The 2024 data shows this payoff more dramatically than ever. U.S. households headed by those with a bachelor's degree or higher now have a median income of $132,700. That is 2.3 times higher than the $58,410 median for households headed by high school graduates. This gap has actually widened significantly from 2004, when college graduates earned about twice as much as high school graduates. To put this in perspective, over the past 20 years, household income for college graduates rose by $15,000, while high school graduates saw essentially no change in their real income. This growing education premium reflects the changing nature of the modern economy and demonstrates why education has become such a critical factor in economic success. But there's a clear, though not straightforward, correlation between education and earnings. We're seeing a growing gap in the remuneration of employees with college degrees and the rest of the labor force. But here's the key insight. There hasn't been a surge in the wages of college graduates. Much of the gap can actually be explained by the reduced earnings of workers lacking college degrees. In recent years, the education gap has reflected a precipitous drop in wages for high school graduates and dropouts rather than big increases for college graduates. This tells us something important about how the economy has changed and suggests that the benefits of education may be as much about avoiding downward mobility as achieving upward mobility. This brings us to an important historical shift. Historically, jobs were filled on the basis of ascribed characteristics, as we spoke about before. Race, gender, and ethnicity were more important than individual abilities. Throughout most of human history, these characteristics usually determine whether you'd be a hunter, a gatherer, a shoemaker, a stonemason, a slave, or a free citizen. Such characteristics are not irrelevant today, but they're not as divisive as in times past. Individual achievements count for a lot when applying for jobs, and job candidates are evaluated based on the capabilities they bring. But we need to ask, to what extent are achieved characteristics like college degrees accurate indicators of these capabilities? So here is where credentialing theory becomes important. If education primarily serves as a filter rather than actually increasing productivity, then we might be caught in a kind of arms race where everyone needs more and more education just to compete for the same jobs. Consider this. Many jobs that now require college degrees were successfully performed by high school graduates in previous generations. Has the job really become more complex, Or are we using education as a convenient screening device? Well, this has important policy implications. So if education mainly serves as a signal, then individual investments in education might be rational but socially wasteful, like everyone standing on tiptoes at a concert to see better. But education reflects more than presumed human capital. It indicates academic ability, but also socioeconomic status. Family background is associated with resources, school quality, and cultural capital. Students from upper income families are much more likely to attend and complete college. Even among students with the highest test scores in 8th grade, 74% from wealthy families graduated from college, compared to only 29% from low income families. Almost the same graduation rate as the lowest scoring students from high income families. These family background factors affect levels of education, which in turn influence occupational choice and the ability to prepare for careers. This raises a fair question. Does occupational success reflect the extent and quality of one's education, or are both directly linked to the family and social class into which someone was born? Some critics argue that education and social class are deeply intertwined. While income distributions have become more unequal, education access has improved but still reflects class position. Others focus on credentialing, the idea that education acts primarily as a screening or filtering mechanism for employers rather than actually developing job-related skills. From this perspective, diplomas serve as a convenient sorting device in an impersonal labor market. The consequences of credentialing include reinforcing patterns of inequality and creating an instrumental view of education, where students focus on getting credentials rather than learning. In the end, college degrees still matter significantly, but this has led to increasing enrollments, potential dilution of academic standards, and many overqualified workers. With more job applicants bearing college degrees, employers have demanded higher educational achievements, a process called certification escalation, where jobs that once required high school diplomas now require college degrees. Let's turn to what may be the most important factor in actually getting jobs. So there's conventional wisdom that say it's not what you know, but who you know. Well, this has been confirmed by research, but the significance of personal ties is more complex than folk wisdom suggests. Research shows that the formal means of finding employment, newspaper ads, employment agency job placement services, account for only a minority of job placements. The majority come through direct personal contacts, often once removed through weak ties like friends of friends. Market theories assume job seekers have access to essential information about jobs and openings, working condition, and wages and salary. But this assumption of perfect information clearly does not hold in the real world. Most jobs are never advertised, and between 70 and 80% of positions are filled through internal promotions, networking, or word of mouth. Some information can be found publicly through job boards and internet sites, but much crucial information is limited. Formal means of job placement often lack relevant information for both job seekers and potential employers. Personal networks provide the kind of detailed insider information about job opportunities, workplace culture, and what employers really want that you simply can't get from official job postings. Networks provide a screening mechanism for employers. They may assume that personal connections qualify someone for a job, even though these connections may be weak. Current employees become major sources of new hires because they can vouch for candidates' character and work ethic. Tapping into social network benefits both parties. Employers get pre-screened candidates, job seekers get access to opportunities and inside information. Networks are particularly significant at lower levels of status and income, where formal hiring processes may be less elaborate. Here's something counterintuitive. Weak ties may be more important than strong ones. You may think close friends and family would be most helpful in finding jobs. But often the opposite is true. This happens because people in your close network travel in similar social and economic circles, limiting access to information about prospective jobs. A less intimate social network, weak ties, acquaintances, customers, or friends, expands your knowledge base and connects you to opportunities you would have never heard about. So, as we wrap up chapter 7, I want you to think about your own experiences with job searching or career planning. So, how do the concepts we've discussed, economic theory, human capital, credentialing, and networks, apply to your situation? The key insights from this chapter are that job markets are more complex than simple supply and demand models suggest. While economic factors matter, social factors like education, family background, and personal networks play crucial roles in determining who gets which jobs. Understanding these dynamics can help you make better decisions about education, career prep, and job searching strategies. The research shows that building professional networks, understanding how credentials work in your field, and recognizing the importance of formal qualification and informal connections are all essential for career success. Most importantly, this chapter reveals how individual career outcomes are shaped by broader social forces. Your job prospects aren't just about individual merit. They're also influenced by social class, educational opportunities, network access, and other structural factors. This concludes chapter 7. So, thank you for paying attention, and I will look forward to discussing all of this with you as we continue exploring our sociology of work.